morning.
Morning, Your Honour.
Yes, Mr Wilcox. And Ms Woodland, good morning.
Thank you, Your Honour.
May it please the Court, I appear with my learned leader, Ms Ward, in 4 sets of inquiries today. The North Black Range Palerang inquiry, the Gulf Road Fire inquiry, the Bees Nest Fire inquiry, and the Liberation Trail inquiry.
Thank you, Mr Wilcox.
Your Honour, these are the closing submissions for the Coronial inquiry into the cause and origin of the fire known as the North Black Range Palerang Fire, which occurred on the lands of the Narragaow, Ngambri and Ngunnawal people. The inquiry has been conducted pursuant to Section 30, subsection 1 of the Coroners Act 2009 and is accordingly limited to determining the cause of the fire and its area of origin if able to be established to the satisfaction of the court. The fire was one of very many fires across the state of New South Wales in the 2019-2020 bushfire season. Not all fires were reported to Your Honour. Not all fires reported to Your Honour proceeded to a coronial inquiry into cause and origin. Not all fires that proceeded to a coronial inquiry into cause and origin will continue to further consideration via a general inquiry as part of Stage 2 of Your Honour's proceedings. And it is submitted that it's not necessary for the North Black Range fire to proceed to further investigation via a general inquiry. The North Black Range Palerang fire burned for approximately 2 months, predominantly within the Queanbeyan Palerang local government area, encompassed within the lands of the Narragaow, Ngambri and Ngunnawal peoples. During the inquiry, the court heard how the fire ultimately burnt over 40,000 hectares within the Talaganda National Park and beyond. At least 30 structures, including 4 homes, were destroyed or damaged in connection with the fire. Pasture was lost, fencing was destroyed, flora and fauna died. Fortunately, no human loss of life ensued. Despite the cause and origin investigations conducted by the New South Wales Rural Fire Service and New South Wales Police, a specific point of origin could not be identified. However, the investigators agreed that the likely cause of the fire was a lightning strike. Turning to a chronology, the North Black Range Palerang fire is believed to have commenced on 25 November 2019 as a result of lightning strike in the Talaganda National Park, west of the township of Braidwood. Your Honour, there has some maps of the general area of origin of that fire now displayed. And turning to the next page, a closer map showing the fire in its proximity to the North Black Range Trail. A range of investigative techniques, including but not limited to analysis of lightning strike data, eyewitness reports of a dry thunderstorm in the area on the evening of 25 November 2019, and later site inspections conducted by the RFS and Forensic and Technical Services Command of New South Wales Police, all point to the fire commencing along the North Black Range Fire Trail, close to the Maloon Fire Trail. The first person to report to 000 a fire in the region of Palerang was from Melbourne Air Traffic Control. That person was in turn passing along information from a pilot on a commercial aircraft who reported seeing a smoke column in the vicinity of Mount Palerang. That call from Melbourne Air Traffic Control occurred at 10:52 a.m. on 26 November 2019. Calls from local residents followed some hours later, with first reports from people in the area of Bombay coming in at around 3:40 p.m. and 3:59 p.m. on the afternoon of 26 November 2019. Prior to that first call to 000 at 10:52 a.m, the National Parks and Wildlife Service had already deployed one of their field officers to go and look for signs of fire because a lightning storm had passed through the area the previous night. As a result, Mr. Lewis Turner travelled to the park. Upon arrival, he met some trail bike riders who confirmed they had seen smoke in the vicinity. This prompted Mr. Turner to continue along the North Black Range Trail within the park until he came across the southern boundary of the fire. An RFS crew from Braidwood met up with Mr Turner within the park. The crew had been dispatched to investigate after the first 000 call from the Melbourne Air Traffic Control had been received. According to Mr Turner, when he arrived at the scene of the fire, the flame height was already well established at around 3 to 4 metres. Now displayed is a photo included within the brief dated 26 November 2019 showing the fire in its relatively early stages, which is a rare opportunity in these types of hearings. According to Scott Hart, captain of the Braidwood RFS, fire behaviour was extremely erratic from the get-go, up to 4 metre flame height, spreading in all directions under variable winds. We attempted to get hose lines around the fire, but it was too dangerous as the bush was too thick and the fire too deep into the scrub to achieve much. Mr Hart requested air support and heavy plant as the fire was too large to fight with only ground crews. He was told there was no air support available and that heavy plant would arrive later. Direct attack was attempted by a mix of RFS and National Parks and Wildlife Service crews, but given terrain and fuel load, this was not successful and put some crews at risk. Edward Smigilski, the Senior Deputy Captain of Hoskingtown Rossi Brigade within the Lake George District, told the court the type, amount and structure of the very dry fuel caused it to reignite behind us in less than a minute, as he and his crew attempted direct attack and tried to reach the head of the fire. Mr Smigilski had to use a crew member to control reignition behind him to secure an escape route while he continued along the southern flank of the fire. This occurred after he had decided it was not safe to escape by going into the black, as burnt and burning trees were falling within that area due to the strong winds. The fire was not suppressed even with the use of dozers to try and establish containment lines later on 26 November 2019. Lightning activity returned on 28 November 2019, and a second ignition within the Talaganda National Park was recorded that day, about 5 kilometres southeast from the first fire. On screen, Your Honour, can see the North Black Range fire as at 27 November 2019 with the Currowan fire to its east at that time by way of line scan. This was recorded by Air Ops reporting back to the Fire Control Centre with a grid location for the approximate area of origin for the second ignition. The fire arising from the second ignition point later merged with the pre-existing fire already burning within the National Park. On 29 November 2019, the North Black Range fire took a significant run in an easterly direction. Now brought up on screen, Your Honour, is a line scan from 29 November 2019, showing an eastern movement of the fire at that time. Residential properties were ultimately lost in Bombay to the east and in Maloon and Warri to the north and northeast. Numerous other outbuildings were also destroyed. Material within the brief provides conflicting dates as to when the fire was listed as out. The officer in charge of the investigation, Detective Senior Constable Ben Waldron of the Arson Unit of the State Crime Command, has given evidence confirming that the fire was listed as out on 28 January 2020. On screen is a map taken from an earlier date, namely fire progression between 26 November 2019 to 5 January 2020, to give Your Honour some idea of the spread of that fire. The court has received into evidence a volume of evidence which includes statements from members of New South Wales Police Force, National Parks and Wildlife Services, and a civilian witness, Ms Christine McGrath. It also includes RFS documents, lightning strike data mapping from the RFS and New South Wales Police and Bureau of Meteorology weather data. The court also received into evidence a general brief relating more broadly to the southern region of New South Wales. Detective Senior Constable Waldron, RFS Fire Investigator Mr Steve May, and Senior Crime Scene Officer Mark Hollins gave oral evidence on 30 September 2021. Turning to some key conclusions from the evidence received in the inquiry, RFS investigator Stephen May observed the scene of the North Black Range fire from the air on 5 December 2019. A specific area of origin for the initial fire could not be determined from the air because the canopy was too dense. Mr. May told the court he even had trouble picking out the actual fire trail itself. What Mr. May could see, however, was a V pattern heading in a southeasterly direction from the eastern side of the fire trail, and at the apex of the V pattern, where one would normally be able to locate an origin, there was also a fire from the fire trail heading in an easterly direction that met up with that V pattern, and the V pattern headed southeast. This gave Mr. May an approximate starting point for the ground level investigation he would later commence. The scene of the second ignition within the park, 5 kilometres to the southeast, was also firstly examined from the air. Mr. May was able to confirm a tree lightning strike as the cause of that ignition. Even from the air, he said the indicators that the second ignition was caused by a lightning strike were, quote, compelling, end quote. This included a lightning-struck tree with deep blood red lightning tracking down the trunk. This was also described as lightning trail or scarring. Mr. May then conducted a ground-level investigation looking to determine the cause and origin of the fire on 16 and 19 December 2019. Mr. May told the court, quote, "We have indicators we look for. So we look for protection, angle of char on trees, sooting, staining, curling, leaf freeze. Most of those indicators were there. But since this fire had actually run over the top of itself, I was mainly relying on surface indications of char and protection, sooting, staining and white ash to follow those indicators back to a specific area of origin," end quote. When Mr. May tracked those directional indicators back to a specific area of origin, he found, quote, "a large disturbance to the soil with large clods that had been propelled out from a lightning strike. That is disturbed soil through disruptive shockwave that was caused by lightning. The surface area around that disturbance, the ground is weathered. However, the soil that was propelled out of that mound is more of a natural earth-looking colour, which indicates it was a recent occurrence," end quote. The court had the benefit of photographs taken by Mr. May at the scene, which, although obviously not as clear as what Mr. May saw at the time, allow the court to follow the conclusions he expressed about this large disturbance to the soil. On screen is just one photo in evidence from Mr. May of that soil ground disturbance. In addition, Mr. May observed a reasonably large blowhole caused by electrical resistance and fire radiating out in all directions from this ignition area. This specific ignition area was some 1.2 kilometres away from the nearest lightning strike recorded on lightning strike data that Mr. May reviewed. This does not mean that the scene Mr. May observed could not have been affected by lightning, as not every lightning strike is recorded within the data, and Mr. May told the court the steep terrain can impact upon the accuracy of the data. Further, the suspect lightning strike was plotted as occurring at 9:46 p.m. on the evening of 26 December 2019. Given the remote location of the National Park, Detective Senior Constable Waldron suggested it was feasible that the fire could burn unobserved until the smoke column was seen the next day. New South Wales Police Senior Crime Scene Investigator Mark Hollands also examined the scene, but as he first attended for this examination on 25 February 2020, he was unable to rely upon potential micro-indicators to settle upon a specific area of origin, much less a point of origin. That is, the scene had degraded with the passage of time. Mr. Hollands told the court that larger scale indicators were still present, and as a result, he was able to come to the conclusion that the area of origin was within the area, as described by the National Parks and Wildlife Service Field Officer Lewis Turner. Shown now on screen is one of the pictures taken by Officer Hollands indicating general area of origin and some macro indicators. Officer Hollands was otherwise willing to defer to the conclusions expressed by RFS investigator May, given that he had examined the scene at a time when some micro-indicators were still evident, even though the fire had burnt back over itself. During his fire investigation, RFS fire investigator May was able to eliminate other potential causes of the fire. He found that there was no evidence of campfire, smoking, debris burning, equipment use, suspicious fire activity, juvenile fire play, rail, power lines, or any other miscellaneous causes in the vicinity of the area of origin. Turning then to the conclusion on cause and origin, it is submitted that the specific area of the origin of the fire was within the Talaganda National Park in an area roughly 8 metres east of the North Black Range Fire Trail. The cause of the North Black Range Fire, it is submitted, was lightning strike on 25 November 2019 at approximately 9:46 p.m. Those assisting the court expressed their thanks to the officer in charge of the investigation and witnesses involved in the cause and origin investigation for their assistance with the Coronial inquiry into the North Black Range Fire. Please the court.
Thank you, Mr. Wilcox.
If it's convenient, Your Honour, I'll turn immediately to the next inquiry, the Gulf Road Fire.
Certainly.
These are the closing submissions for the Coronial inquiry into the cause and origin of the fire known as the Gulf Road Fire. This inquiry is being conducted pursuant to Section 30, subsection 1 of the Coroners Act 2009 and is accordingly limited to determining the cause of the fire and its area of origin, if able to be established to the satisfaction of the court. Again, this was one of the very many fires across the state of New South Wales in the 2019 to 2020 bushfire season. Not all fires were reported to the coroner. Not all fires reported to the coroner proceeded to a coronial inquiry into cause and origin. Not all fires that proceeded to a coronial inquiry into the cause and origin will continue to further consideration via a general inquiry as part of Stage 2 of Your Honour's proceedings. It's submitted that it is not necessary for the Gulf Road Fire to proceed to further investigation via a general inquiry. Whilst a number of buildings were damaged or destroyed, and the townships of Emmaville and Torrington were terribly impacted, the fact remains that nothing further will be learnt about the cause and origin if the fire proceeds to further investigation. Further, whilst there are a variety of views as to the nature and adequacy of the Rural Fire Service response, similar issues arise in other matters, which will proceed to a Stage 2 hearing because there is better evidence available to explore that issue via a case study hearing. This court has neither the resources nor the reach of a Royal Commission, and difficult decisions need to be made about the allocation of limited resources to further investigate particular matters. The Gulf Road Fire burned for 5 weeks, predominantly within the Tenterfield Shire, but also extending into the neighbouring Glen Innes, Severn local government area. The area of origin of the Gulf Road Fire is in remote country, approximately 26 kilometres northwest of the township of Emmaville and approximately the same distance from the township of Torrington. On screen is a Google map showing the general area of origin of the Gulf Road Fire, and another map showing, if Your Honour can see it, the towns of Emmaville and Torrington to the right-hand side of the red flag where that fire is believed to have commenced. No cause and origin investigation was conducted by the New South Wales Rural Fire Service or New South Wales Police. Detective Senior Constable Ramsey and her colleagues at Glen Innes were tasked with travelling to the suspected area of origin 11 months after the fire. Regeneration in the surrounding area and passage of time did not assist with this investigation. Therefore, the primary source of evidence concerning the cause and origin of this fire comes from the eyewitness account of Mr. Robert Overmars. Turning to a chronology of events, on 26 October 2019, Mr. Overmars was at home on Gulf Road, Emmaville, when he saw a storm developing to the northwest of an airstrip or runway on his property. At about 5 p.m, he saw a cloud-to-ground lightning strike on Trap Mountain, northwest of the runway on his property. About 3 to 4 seconds later, he heard thunder. As a result, he estimated the distance of the lightning strike to be between 1 to 1.4 kilometres to the northwest of his location. This places the lightning strike coming to ground in rough granite terrain containing large boulders and dry bushland. It is inaccessible by vehicle. On screen is one of the pictures of the general area of origin to give Your Honour some idea of the nature of the terrain. After interviewing Mr Overmars at his property, the officer in charge of the investigation, Detective Senior Constable Nicole Ramsey, later obtained lightning strike data for the relevant area across the period of 20 October 2019 to 28 October 2019. The data confirmed lightning strike activity in the area on 26 October 2019, but on a first review of the data, it did not accord with the time reported by Mr Overmars. Returning to the chronology, throughout the evening of 26 October 2019, Mr Overmars and his wife, Winnie, smelt fresh bushfire smoke, but were unsure if the smoke was a new fire or fire from an established fire burning in the region at the time. The smell of smoke was intermittent and only light at that stage. On 27 October 2019, at around 1:30 p.m, the Overmars and friends who were visiting saw a plane fly over the runway on the Overmars property and circle the area where Mr Overmars had observed the lightning strike the previous day. A short time later, he observed smoke coming from that area. A short time later, they thought the smoke smell was stronger and fresher. Mr Overmars went to investigate and saw a wispy column of smoke coming from the general area where he believes the lightning reached the earth. Fire was not yet visible, but Mr Overmars called the RFS Centre in Glen Innes. He took some photos of the smoke and sent at least one of them to the RFS and provided details about water sources on his property. Shown now on screen are some photos of the smoke column taken by Mr Overmars. At around 5 p.m. on 27 October 2019, Mr Overmars estimated that the fire was about 20 hectares in size and was burning in a northeasterly direction. He continued to stress the need for resources to prevent the fire spreading. At around the same time, a caller contacted 000 to report a fire 20 kilometres south of Bonshaw over the Beardy River Bridge on Gulf Road. According to Mr Overmars, RFS crews attended the Overmars property. He cleared a containment line on his property and continued to monitor the situation and prepare his property. The fire continued to spread over the coming week, however, it was not rapidly spreading. On 7 and 8 November 2019, the situation worsened as weather conditions deteriorated. The fire broke containment lines despite extensive firefighting efforts. The fire tore through Torrington and surrounding areas. On screen is a fire progression map from the period 7 November 2019 and then 8 November 2019. Over the next 2 weeks, firefighting crews worked to contain the fire through backburning, blacking out, establishing new containment lines and aerial attack. The fire continued to burn. A large storm brought much needed rain to the area on 28 and 29 November 2019, with the fire being declared out on 30 November 2019. On screen now is a map showing fire progression as at 1 December 2019 after that fire had been marked out. It seems, though, that the fire continued to burn in remote spots even after this time. Mr and Mrs Overmars report that they had fire on their property in hollow trees and smouldering in tree stumps right until Christmas 2019. During the inquiry, the court heard how the fire ultimately burnt over 74,000 hectares of land, roughly comprised of 41,438 hectares of private land, 29,653 hectares of national park, and 1,666 hectares of state forest. Dozens of buildings and structures were impacted, including 27 homes damaged or destroyed in the towns of Torrington, Emmaville, Silent Grove, and Dumeric Valley. The most severely impacted of those communities, Torrington, was home to about 100 people, where 16 residences were damaged or destroyed, with there being other buildings partially damaged. The court received into evidence a volume of evidence comprising 176 pages, which includes statements from members of the New South Wales Police Force and a log of complaint by Mr. Robert Overmars. It also includes RFS documents, lightning strike data mapping from the RFS and New South Wales Police and Bureau of Meteorology weather data. Turning to some key conclusions, Detective Senior Constable Ramsey told the court that she obtained lightning strike data which showed lightning in the area of origin as reported by Mr. Overmars, but the intelligence did not match Mr. Overmars' account of lightning at around 5 p.m. Detective Ramsey told the court she was really quite surprised that the lightning data didn't marry up with Mr. Overmars' account of events because he seemed truthful and reliable in his evidence. So it proved, because on closer review of the data, Detective Ramsey uncovered that the times were recorded in UTC, or Universal Time Coordinated, and when the times were converted into Australian Eastern Daylight Saving Time, it placed lightning strikes in the area on the afternoon of 26 October 2019. Later, RFS lightning data also corroborated Mr. Overmars' account of lightning on 26 October 2019. Notably, there were 7 lightning strikes recorded in the vicinity of Gulf Road on 26 October 2019. Lightning strikes commenced at around 5 p.m, extending through to about 5:21 p.m. This is broadly consistent with Mr. Overmars' evidence of having observed lightning strikes in the region at around 5 p.m. On screen is one document showing lightning strike data overlaid on a map from the period 26 October 19, 11 a.m. to the same time, 27 October 2019. Although no RFS or Forensic and Evidence Technical Services investigation took place in relation to the cause and origin of the Gulf Road fire, early evidence of RFS fire progression mapping suggests, but does not prove on its own, that the fire originated somewhere towards the end of Gulf Road. Detective Senior Constable Ramsey provided evidence that the area of origin, as reported by Mr. Robert Overmars, was extremely remote. She was able to eliminate other potential causes of the fire, specifically power lines, campfires, smoking, human activity, equipment, juvenile fire, and rail infrastructure, all eliminated as potential causes of the Gulf Road fire. In concluding the submissions, it is submitted that the court could be satisfied, even in the absence of a cause and origin investigation at the suspected scene of the fire. The area of origin of the Gulf Road fire was a remote area of bushland on a private property at 3133 Gulf Road, Emmaville, known as Trap Mountain. The cause of the Gulf Road fire, it's submitted, was a lightning strike on 26 October 2019 at approximately 5 p.m. Those assisting the court expressed thanks to the officer in charge of the investigation for her assistance with the Coronial inquiry into the Gulf Road fire. Thanks are also extended to Mr. Robert Overmars, whose evidence proved definitive in establishing the fire cause and origin. Please, the court.
Thank you, Mr. Wilcox. Yes, Ms. Ward.
Your Honour's consideration will now move today to the closing submissions for the inquiry into the Bees Nest fire. And I'll start firstly with some introductory matters. These are the closing submissions for the Coronial inquiry into cause and origin of the fire known as the Bees Nest fire. The Bees Nest fire originated in the Armidale Regional Council local government area and crossed into the Clarence Valley and the Bellingen local government areas, encompassing the lands of the Gumbajan people. The inquiry has been conducted pursuant to Section 30, subsection 1 of the Coroners Act of 2009 and is accordingly limited to determining the cause of the fire and its area of origin, if able to be established to the satisfaction of the court. This fire was one of very many fires across the state of New South Wales in the 2019-2020 bushfire season. Not all fires were reported to Your Honour. Not all fires reported to Your Honour or to any of the other coroners for the state proceeded to a coronial inquiry into cause and origin. Not all fires that proceeded to a coronial inquiry into the cause and origin will continue to further consideration via a general inquiry as part of stage 2 of Your Honour's proceedings. So what I'm emphasising here, Your Honour, is that there's been a filtering process applied at every stage. Your Honour will recall yesterday, Mr Castleton of Senior Counsel observed that over 11,000 fires had been reported to New South Wales Police across that season. And so fires have been filtered and filtered and filtered through the inquiry process. In those circumstances, it is submitted that it is not necessary for the Bees Nest fire to proceed to further investigation via a general inquiry. Whilst the brief of evidence does contain concerns and questions from community members about why certain decisions were made at certain points in time in an effort to contain the fire, it is not possible for this court to attempt to answer every question raised in every brief collated across the 2019-2020 bushfire season. As noted in the opening submissions for this fire, many community members impacted by the Bees Nest fire were troubled by things such as vegetation management and fuel loads in the lead up to the fire commencing. They were also troubled by communication issues and warnings whilst the fire was threatening homes, and the use of out-of-town volunteers to fight the fire with no local knowledge of geography or typical conditions. Whilst I acknowledge these concerns in these submissions, other case studies will pick up on similar issues in the course of Stage 2 representative hearings. Then to the specifics of the Bees Nest fire. I'm just going to have the image from page 134 of the brief brought up on the screen. Your Honour will be able to see the Bees Nest fire marked on the map, and it's being presently circled by the cursor. So the Bees Nest fire originated on the Bees Nest Trail, located within the Guy Fawkes National Park in the New England tablelands west of Dorrigo. It burned for approximately 2.5 months and impacted over 113,000 hectares of publicly and privately owned land. Approximately 40 structures, including nearly a dozen homes, were damaged or destroyed by the fire. I'll now have some extracts from the brief brought up on screen. These are contained within pages 210 to 211 of the brief, and they just show some of the devastation wreaked by the fire and illustrate more evocatively than do the numbers when we talk about the mere numbers of houses affected. The photos illustrate more evocatively what that means for the particular families and individuals who lost so much. In addition, a number of vehicles, farming equipment, infrastructure and machinery was also lost. There was also, of course, enormous impact on flora and fauna, including the destruction of a number of koala habitats on the Dorrigo Plateau. Chronology of Events. The following chronology is drawn from evidence the court received within the Coronial Brief of Evidence, which includes statements from officers from New South Wales Police, fire investigators from the Rural Fire Service, civilian witnesses, RFS lightning strike data, RFS and National Parks and Wildlife Service operational documents, photographs and video footage, and weather data from the Bureau of Meteorology. The chronology that follows does not purport to be an exhaustive account, noting there were many accounts of the terrifying impact this fire had on the small communities living beneath the Guy Fawkes River National Park. Those accounts are set out within the brief of evidence. Further, given that the inquiry is limited to cause and origin of the fire, the chronology will focus upon such matters with only a brief recitation of fire progress until the fire was declared out. On the evening of 30 August 2019, so this is a winter fire, a storm passed through Guy Fawkes River National Park. 4 lightning strikes were recorded within the vicinity of where the Bees Nest fire is believed to have originated. Page 64 of the brief will now be displayed. Although it's a little hard to make out on the screen, when Your Honour has regard to that page within the brief, Your Honour will be able to see very many lightning strikes recorded on that map. And in particular, 4 lightning strikes are highlighted in the key to the right, which are in the vicinity of the Bees Nest fire. So that's the 30th of August 2019. The next day, 31 August 2019, Steve Meppen, manager of the New England district of the Rural Fire Service, sent a text message at 5:49 p.m. to Hannah Birkenhead, who was the duty officer with the RFS at the Glen Innes Fire Control Centre. Mr. Meppen surmised that the fire had started as a result of the storm the previous evening, so the storm that's reflected in the lightning strike data. At 9:04 a.m. the next day, so the 1st of September 2019, the Bees Nest fire was authorised as going and was initially managed by the National Parks and Wildlife Service. According to its timestamp, at 1:27 p.m, a fixed camera at Mount Highland, which is broadly to the east of the Bees Nest Trail, captured this photograph of the Bees Nest fire, showing a plume of smoke emerging from the bushland. Your Honour, this photograph of the fire is taken from page 66 of the brief and shows the remote area in which the fire was first observed to be burning. Early firefighting efforts, including aerial bucketing and ground mop-up, effectively contained the fire, which was around 6 hectares at that time. On 3 September 2019, the fire spread significantly due to unfavourable weather conditions. Favourable for fire spread, but unfavourable for the communities that would ultimately be impacted by the fire. At 10:03 a.m. on 5 September 2019, then Commissioner Shane Fitzsimmons, AOAFSM, made a declaration under Section 44 of the Rural Fires Act 1997 in respect of a number of fires burning in the Armidale Regional Council local government area and giving the RFS control over firefighting operations in that area. So initially this fire had been managed by the National Parks and Wildlife Service, and then the Section 44 declaration was made. The Bees Nest fire was one of the fires within the footprint of the Section 44 declaration. Notwithstanding the declaration, an RFS situation report at 1:43 p.m. this day listed the fire's status as being controlled, with authorities continuing at that point to hold the fire. So page 137 and 138 of the brief will now be displayed. Page 137 shows the Bee's Nest fire on fire progression mapping in its infancy, well, that is to say, around the 5th of September 2019. And if we next move to page 138 of the brief, Your Honour will be able to see how quickly the fire had spread by the time of this fire progression mapping, which is dated the 6th of September. So by the morning of 6 September, the date of that second image, authorities had continued to hold the Bee's Nest fire, but this situation could not prevail for long, following a critical change in wind and further deterioration in weather conditions. At 11:30 a.m, the fire breached containment at Bowyard Creek and rapidly spread east, spotting hundreds of metres ahead of the main fire front. The firefighter crews and heavy plant were evacuated. Aircrafts were grounded due to high winds, and a strike team from Tamworth, alongside 2 bulk water carriers and other supports, were dispatched for property protection. Once the fire crossed the Guy Fawkes River, it was feared that properties in the locality of Marengo, north of Ebor, would be impacted in less than an hour. I'll now have some further pages brought up from the brief, taken by showing photos taken by one of the RFS group captains who was responding to the Bee's Nest fire. And these just show the reach of the smoke plume as the fire took a run on the 6th of September 2019. At 3:42 p.m, an RFS situation report noted that the fire had breached the Guy Fawkes River and was spreading rapidly towards Marengo. It was during this afternoon that police officers in Armidale were alerted by the RFS about imminent risk to life and property. Detective Senior Constables Mark Simmons and Matthew Robertson were dispatched to assist. As they approached Ebor by road around 5:30 p.m, Detective Robertson took a number of videos showing an enormous plume of smoke north of Ebor, 2 of which were played to Your Honour during the opening. During this closing, I'll just have some of those photographs, so the still photographs brought up on the screen, taken from page 201 through to 204 of the brief, and showing the scene that the Detective Senior Constables were driving towards as they were dispatched to protect life and property. Sadly, Your Honour knows that several properties in Marengo, Hernani, Tyringham, Dundurabin and other localities were damaged or destroyed as a result of the Bee's Nest fire. The brief included accounts of residents in these small communities defending their properties, but eventually being forced to hide from the intense fire in order to protect their own lives. While fortunately no one lost their life, many were deeply traumatised by their terrifying experiences, including the young students and staff who were typically charged with caring for them at Hernani Public School. It was not until 13 November 2019 that the Bee's Nest fire was declared out. Key conclusions as to cause and origin for the fire. The officer in charge of the Coronial investigation, Detective Acting Inspector James Crotty, and the Rural Fire Service fire investigator Mark Fulliger gave oral evidence before Your Honour on 9 March 2022. Whilst Detective Acting Inspector Crotty had initially recorded the start date for the Bees Nest fire as 16 August 2019, he conceded in oral evidence that this date could be wrong. It was based on his recollection of a brief discussion with Mr Fullagar at the Glen Innes Fire Control Centre in the context of the officer in charge visiting that centre to discuss another fire, the Mount Mackenzie fire near Tenterfield. None of the other evidence set out within the Coronial brief or given in oral evidence during the hearing in March corroborates 16 August 2019 as a likely start date for this fire. And in my submission, the court can therefore safely ignore the start date as listed on the original report of fire to coroner. Evidence as to cause and origin was centred around the expert opinion expressed by Mark Fullagar, Training Coordinator for Fire Investigation and Compliance with the RFS, and a trained fire investigator. This was in circumstances where Detective Acting Inspector Crotty was not a trained fire investigator himself. Sergeant Nicole Hill of the New South Wales Police Forensic Evidence and Technical Services Command had conducted a scene investigation of the suspected area of origin for the Bees Nest fire, but this didn't happen until 2 October 2020, well over a year after ignition. Sergeant Hill was, therefore, unable to form an opinion as to cause of origin because time, rainfall and regrowth had eliminated many of the indicators that a trained fire investigator would otherwise look for at the scene. Mark Fullagar had been able to attend the scene on 13 September 2019. That is, within a couple of weeks of suspected ignition of the fire. This was obviously much closer in time to the inspection from Sergeant Nicole Hill. Mr Fullagar's evidence as to the cause and origin of the fire is to be accepted. Mr Fullagar told the court that his initial approach to the general area of origin was guided by where initial firefighting operations took place. He there identified a plateau within the National Park as having the least amount of fire damage relative to its surrounds, indicating to him that the fire had originated there. In his words, with fire investigations, you move from areas of most damage to areas of least damage. Mr Fullagar was accompanied on his scene investigation by another RFS fire investigator, Stephen May. According to Mr Fullagar, in a lot of these larger investigations, we tend to put 2 fire investigators onto the incident so that we have another set of eyes and to run the investigations through. Here, Mr Fullagar and Mr May decided to split up and independently track fire indicators along different flanks of the fire. Whilst they were in communication with each other through this process, they were up to 50 metres away from each other and out of sight one from the other due to the intervening sloping terrain. So some images of that terrain taken from the brief will now be displayed on the screen. These are from pages 44, 46, 57 and 58. Your Honour will see firstly, the first 2 photos were establishment photos, so they show the general area of origin, and this photo in particular, whilst it shows in the caption to the photo, low intensity fire travelling up slope, Your Honour will there see the words that follow top to bottom of photo. In his oral evidence, Mr Fullagar flipped that and says it's low intensity fire travelling up slope, and it's travelling from the bottom of the photo up to the top, which makes sense when one has a look at the slope that's obvious in the photo. We then have here a view, according to the caption, looking west from the tree, and we'll come to the tree further in a moment, down the knoll. And again, low intensity fire has backed down the hill away from the tree, as well as travelling below the ridge line. Another photo, this time looking north from the subject tree that was of most interest to Mr. Fullagar. So Mr. Fullagar and Mr. May tracked the scene independently and tracked the fire back to a likely point of origin, being a turpentine tree bearing the hallmarks of lightning strike. Page 47 of the brief will now be displayed. This is the turpentine tree. Thus, the point of origin was corroborated by the differing route taken by each investigator, but leading to the same point of origin, being this turpentine tree. So this tree was photographed and recorded by Mr. Fullagar in the course of his report. It was, however, Mr. Fullagar's oral evidence, to Your Honour, that really explained to the court the relevance of the things that were captured within the photographs. Page 51 of the brief will now be displayed. This is what Mr. Fullagar identified as a prominent lightning scar extending vertically down the turpentine tree all the way to ground level. He told Your Honour that he did not know of anything else that might leave such a scar on a tree other than lightning. He said that the scar revealed the, in his words, actual raw timber of the tree. That's within its inner trunk, as displayed in this photo, which looked fresh and, at least to his mind, excluded the possibility that the tree had been struck by lightning, but in some months prior to the Bees Nest fire. So Mr. Fullagar's observations as to the raw timber of the tree fitted the timeline for the Bees Nest fire. Mr. Fullagar also identified the entry point of lightning from the tree to the earth. He was able to ascertain this by identifying rocks which had been disturbed and were sitting above ground under recently disturbed, lighter coloured fresh dirt, all of which suggested to him that the rocks had been recently displaced. Sooting on rocks nearby suggested that the fire had moved away from the area of this turpentine tree, and in other words, the fire had emanated from the vicinity of this tree. In his cause and origin investigation report, Mr. Fullagar also had regard to lightning strike data. This revealed 4 strikes in close proximity to the lightning struck tree. They displayed on the map that was shown earlier during the closing submissions. However, there was no precise match between lightning strike data and the location of the apparently lightning damaged tree. Mr. Fullagar attributed this discrepancy to the fact that lightning strike data is not 100% accurate. The data was largely corroborative of Mr. Fullagar's opinion as to the cause and origin of the Bees Nest fire, based upon his physical investigation at the scene. In his own words, the lightning data that we get is only a guide and it's not 100% correct. And to confirm it, you need to put boots on the ground and look for a lightning struck tree. Your Honour, I'll just pause here to observe that this is also consistent with the evidence outlined in opening submissions for stage 2 yesterday, taken from the general brief of evidence, which includes some reports to Your Honour provided by the Bureau of Meteorology and also by Metro Weather, which discuss the accuracy and reliability of lightning strike data, and which was summarised broadly in that general opening, because it is a theme that arises in detail in so many of the small cause and origin inquiries that Your Honour has conducted. The lightning data will not record every strike to ground. Finally, coming back to the bee's nest evidence, other causes of the fire were excluded for want of evidence of any competent ignition source identified in the remote terrain of the general area of origin. So, conclusion as to cause and origin of the fire. Excuse me. It is submitted that cause of the bee's nest fire was a lightning strike to a tree on or about 30 August 2019, and the origin of the fire was a remote area of the Guy's Fork River National Park on a plateau near the Bee's Nest Trail. Those assisting the court express their sincere gratitude to those who have provided information to the court to assist with the coronial inquiry into the cause and origin of the Bee's Nest fire, including the first responders and government agencies involved in fire suppression efforts and the protection of life and property, but also gratitude to the people who were so clearly affected by the fire and took the time to speak to police or to provide statements in their own right.
Yes, thank you, Ms Ward.
I should indicate, Your Honour, that prior to today's hearings, we had understood from the Rural Fire Service that they did not seek to be heard in response to the fire submissions being given today. But I'm sure if I've got that wrong, Ms Woodland will let Your Honour know.
Ms Woodland, if there's any submissions you wish to make, obviously, please let us know.
Thank you, Your Honour. Nothing at the moment.
Thank you.
Your Honour, I'll now turn to the closing submissions for Your Honour's inquiry into the Liberation Trail fire. The Liberation Trail fire takes its name from a trail that winds its way through old growth forests in the northeastern section of the Guy Fawkes River National Park. Some footage will now be shown on the screen, taken from page 38 and onwards of the brief, being aerial photograph from the National Parks and Wildlife Service, just showing the remote nature of the terrain along the Liberation Trail fire. And of course, the terrain of the surrounding national park. These photos clearly show that the national park is a heavily forested area, and it sits on the eastern edge of the New England tablelands east of Dorrigo. The Guy Fawkes River State Conservation Area, the Chalundi National Park, the Chalundi State Conservation Area, and various nature reserves are found nearby the Guy Fawkes National Park. This inquiry has been conducted pursuant to Section 30, subsection 1 of the Coroners Act 2009, and is accordingly limited to determining the cause of the fire and its area of origin, if able to be established to the satisfaction of the court. This fire was one of very many fires across the state of New South Wales in the 2019-2020 bushfire season. This has been repeated in each of the submissions that Your Honour has heard so far this week, but it's because it's important that people who are interested in one particular fire understand where that fire fits within the broader context. So not all of the fires reported to the coroner across the 2019-2020 bushfire season proceeded to a coronial inquiry into cause and origin. Not all fires that received a coronial inquiry into cause and origin will continue to further consideration via a general inquiry as part of stage 2 of Your Honour's proceedings. It is submitted that it is not necessary for the Liberation Trail fire to proceed to further investigation via a general inquiry. Whilst the brief of evidence includes questions from community members about why certain decisions were made and why so many firefighting crews were staffed by people who were not local to the area, it is not possible for this court to attempt to answer every question raised in every brief collated across the season. Furthermore, the very reach of fires across the state and across the season answers some questions about why out-of-town crews had to be brought in to respond to the crisis. So here is the fire progression map taken from page 257 of the brief, showing the Liberation Trail fire towards the centre of the coloured section of the map, Bees Nest Fire to the south, and many fires extending to the northeast, along with the Kangawalla fire up to the northwest. So what the court can see here is that the Liberation Trail fire had the Kangawalla fire burning to the northwest and Bees Nest Fire to the south, all at the same time. Local crews were never going to be able to contain or adequately respond to these fires without the help of out-of-area crews. The focus of further investigations, including on matters raised in the New South Wales bushfire inquiry, was on how to improve communication on the fire grounds so that even out-of-area crews can have the benefit of understanding from locals who are also on the ground. Moving then to the Liberation Trail fire. The Liberation Trail fire was one of the largest fires that burned in New South Wales across the 2019-2020 season. It destroyed approximately 183,000 hectares of land, a significant proportion of which was old growth forest within the Guy Fawkes River National Park. The fire burnt primarily in the Clarence Valley local government area, but also extended into the Glen Innes and Coffs Harbour local government areas. This is within the lands of the Gumbaynggirr people. What is classified as the Liberation Trail fire is in fact comprised of 5 separate fires which eventually merged into one. The 4 fires which merged with the Liberation Trail fire and ultimately took its name were originally called the Black Mountain Road Fire, 1260 Road Fire, Muck Creek Fire, and Schultz Road Fire. The Liberation Trail Fire is also known to some, or by some, as the Nimboida Fire, given the devastating impact it had on that village in November of 2019. The Liberation Trail fire in its totality burned for 2 months between late October and late December 2019, impacting on a number of villages, including Nimboida, Nana Glen, Glenray, Newton Boyd, Buckarumby, Coots Crossing, Kangaroo Creek, Glenugie, Lenitza, Wells Crossing and Kremnos. It is difficult to know if the figures within the brief are precise because not all damage was necessarily reported and counted, but it is estimated that the fire destroyed 124 homes and damaged at least another 36. It destroyed 252 other structures and damaged an additional 107. It injured 37 people and probably left many more with psychological damage, although thankfully no lives were lost. The following chronology is drawn from the evidence the court received within the Coronial brief, including statements from officers of New South Wales Police and a Rural Fire Service fire investigator, Rural Fire Service lightning strike data, operational documents and weather data from the Bureau of Meteorology. The chronology also draws extensively from the evidence of Mark Fulliger, the training coordinator for fire investigation and compliance with the RFS, and Senior Sergeant Scott Gain, attached to the Northern Rivers Crime Scene Services Branch for New South Wales Police, who each gave oral evidence on 9 March 2022. The chronology doesn't purport to be an exhaustive account, noting this enormous fire affected so many communities. Further, given that the inquiry is limited to cause and origin, the chronology will focus upon those matters with only a brief recitation of fire progress until it was declared out. Between 11 a.m. on 24 October and 11 a.m. 25 October 2019, there was lightning activity across the broader region, as well as at least one strike within the Chalundai National Park to the east of where the Liberation Trail fire is believed to have commenced. So this lightning strike data will now be displayed on the screen, taken from page 330-10 of the brief. That clearly highlights the reach of lightning strike activity right across that region. Within the space of a few hours, on 25 October 2019, 4 fires were recorded as going by the RFS, all within close succession. The timing of these events is demonstrative of the enormous pressure placed on firefighting resources this day, noting that the fire season had already started unseasonably early in the region, with the Bees Nest fire to the south of Liberation Trail believed to have commenced on the 30th of August 2019. So page 245 of the brief will now be displayed on the screen. This is a fire progression map which shows the location of the 4 fires that I've just referred to, 4 fires recorded as going on the 25th of October in close succession to each other. At 9:18 a.m. on 25 October, the Schultz Road fire was authorised as going. You can see the Schultz Road fire being highlighted on the map. It is located within the Ellis State Forest within the Armidale Regional Council local government area. Only 10 minutes later, at 9:28 a.m, the Muck Creek fire was authorised as going. Your Honour can see that to the northeast of Schultz Road. This fire was also within the Armidale Regional Council local government area. Then 90 minutes later, at 10:58 a.m, the Black Mountain Road fire was located as going, authorised as going, I should say. This fire was burning in the Kangaroo State Forest within the Clarence Valley local government area. Then a couple of hours later, at 1:48 p.m, the 1260 Road fire was authorised as going. This was also within the Clarence Valley local government area. Meanwhile, as you can see from the map, the Bees Nest fire to the west, had already been burning for close to 2 months and had been divided into a number of sectors for the purpose of firefighting efforts. One of those sectors was called the Liberation Sector. It sat to the northeast of the suspected area of origin for the Bees Nest fire and incorporated a section of the Liberation Trail. Your Honour, that will become evident from some maps and footage that will be displayed later during the closing submissions. A chronology of events prepared by the RFS and included within the brief of evidence show firefighting crews were active within and along the Liberation sector of the Bees Nest fire in the days leading up to the Liberation Trail fire being authorised as going. RFS records demonstrate there was a reignition of the Bees Nest fire somewhere in the Liberation sector on 25 October 2019, with National Parks and Wildlife crews responding with air support. Entries from the RFS chronology the next day, 26 October 2019, refer to crews managing hotspots in the Liberation sector, for instance on the nearby Broadmeadows Trail. Crews were reported to be mopping up and patrolling within that sector of the Bees Nest fire later that day, and a dozer was being used to put in dozer lines. As referred to earlier in these submissions, between 11 a.m. on 26 October and 11 a.m. the next day, there was the substantial lightning activity within the region, leading to the 4 fires being reported to the east. On 27 October 2019, RFS records reported hotspots on the Broadmeadows Trail of the Bees Nest fire and areas of concern within the Liberation sector of that fire being addressed with air support. At 2:40 p.m, an entry in RFS records read slop over on Liberation Trail at GR 343870. Crews requesting air support, HT 337 and HT 297 in the vicinity, and have been contacted to support ground crews. Crews confident they will knock it down at this stage. So that's an extract from the RFS records. In his evidence, Mr Fullager told Your Honour that the term slop over refers to a determination of when a fire breaks its containment line or a spot from a fire. So this suggests, Your Honour, that a spot over was observed on the Liberation Trail on the afternoon of 27 October. Then, at 5:37 p.m. that afternoon, a lightning strike was recorded within the vicinity of where the Liberation Trail fire was mapped as originating, but a little way off to the east. So within the vicinity, but not a neat co-location. At 6:31 p.m, an entry in RFS records was made which read, DivCom West, working with crews on Liberation Trail, have got around the spot over on the eastern side of the Liberation Trail. There needs to be crews tomorrow to aggressively mop up and patrol. DivCom reports that there is active edge west of Liberation Trail. Therefore, 27 October 2019 represents the first date that fire near the Liberation Trail and north of the northern edge of the Bees Nest fire itself was first reported. The evidence is not any more precise as to where exactly the slop over or the spot over on the Liberation Trail occurred. Page 247 of the brief will now be displayed. This is, again, fire progression mapping. And what it shows is that on 28 October 2019, according to the mapping, there was a very small fire on the Liberation Trail, which was then still categorised as part of the Bees Nest fire on the ICON database. And you can barely see that small dot, Your Honour, on this map. You see the Bees Nest fire is shaded in brown, and it's right to the northern edge of the top reach of the Bees Nest fire, that tiny little spot, and we might just circle it. There we go. The Liberation Trail, a fire on the Liberation Trail, then still being identified as part of the Bees Nest fire. On 30 October 2019, then Commissioner Shane Fitzsimmons, AO AFSM, made a declaration under Section 44 of the Rural Fires Act 1997, giving the RFS control of firefighting efforts within parts of the Clarence Valley local government area. We're going to now move to page 253 from the brief, which is the fire progression mapping for 4 November 2019, the day that the Liberation Trail fire was authorised as going. So this is not to be confused with the date of ignition. As noted above, there is evidence that this fire had been burning from at least 27 October, but it was authorised as going on 4 November. And Your Honour can compare the size of the fire in this map compared to the previous map, where it was not much more than a smudge to the north of the Bees Nest fire. And by this time you can see that it's actually listed as a separate fire, and there it is on the showing as Liberation Trail, just to the north of the northern reaches of the Bees Nest fire. I'll now have some other pages brought up from the brief, from page 255 through to page 257. And it'll be a series of fire progression maps. The Liberation Trail fire was particularly fierce, burning in a particularly fierce fashion from 6 through to 8 November 2019, as evident in the way in which the fire progresses through this progression of fire progression mapping. It was at this time that it impacted the village of Nimboida and surrounding areas, causing considerable property loss and forcing some residents of Nimboida to shelter under the Nimboida Bridge for safety. Then moving to page 258 of the brief, fire progression mapping for 9 November 2019 shows the Liberation Trail fire has merged with the Schultz Road, Muck Creek, Black Mountain Road and 1260 Road fires. At that stage, the combined Liberation Trail fire was recorded as having a 70-kilometre distance from east to west and a perimeter of 463 kilometres. From 11 to 12 November 2019, the fire threatened and variously impacted upon the area around the towns of Nana Glen and Glenray. There was a favourable weather change around 20 and 21 November, which allowed fire suppression activities to ramp up. By 24 November 2019, 85% of the fire was believed to be contained. By the end of that month, it no longer posed any operational issues. It was not until rainfall on the fire ground in December 2019 that the fire was eventually declared out on 24 December of that year. Key conclusions as to cause and origin. The evidence of Mr. Fullagar is most useful in reviewing possible causes for the Liberation Trail fire and some of the other fires that commenced independently but later merged with it. He attended the scenes of the Liberation Trail, Muck Creek and Schultz Road fires at the request of New South Wales Police in August of 2020. Mr. Fullagar was keen to emphasise in his evidence before Your Honour that his role was to assist New South Wales Police in their investigation rather than to perform an RFS cause and origin investigation. A cause and origin investigation, if directed into these fires, would have been typically performed much closer to the time the fires started, which would have enabled observation of still present fire indicators and discussions with on-scene crews. RFS investigations could also typically take into account previous fire history in the area. Mr. Fullagar's evidence is emphasised in the submissions that follow in conjunction with evidence the court received from New South Wales Police fire investigations. Firstly, dealing with the Schultz Road fire. On 12 August 2020, Mr. Fullagar attended the Schultz Road fire scene with Acting Sergeant Justin Powell of the Forensic Evidence and Technical Services Command with Coffs Harbour Crime Section. Acting Sergeant Powell described the Schultz Road fire scene as a remote area in dense bushland with steep terrain. Mr. Fullagar concurred with Acting Sergeant Justin Powell that the angle of char fire indicators still visible at the scene at that time showed a fire moving from the west of Schultz Road near the intersection of Benjable Road. The majority of other fire indicators had been lost due to the passage of time. So this footage, the photo displayed now is taken from page 144 of the brief, and it's taken with the photographer looking south, and it shows the fire moving from the west of Schultz Road across the road, heading towards the east. And the angle of char fire indicators that Mr. Fulliger referred to in his evidence are highlighted by the four red arrows on those 4 trees in the photo. These observations, made as late as August 2020, were consistent with the presence of active fire to the west of Schultz Road as originally mapped by the RFS responders to the fire. The remote location meant that there was no infrastructure, power lines or rail lines in the area, which might be implicated as the cause of the fire, but there was otherwise little to assist in determining the cause of the fire so long after the event. Lightning strike data later obtained showed some recorded lightning strikes broadly in the vicinity of the area where the Schultz Road fire likely originated, but there was no precise overlap. More importantly, Mr. Fulliger's evidence was that, and these are his words, we were unable to actually do a full scene examination due to the regrowth, and we were unable to identify any lightning-struck trees or ground. In those circumstances, both of the fire investigators concluded that the cause of the Schultz Road fire was undetermined. Moving then to the Muck Creek fire. On 12 August 2020, Mr. Fulliger also attended the Muck Creek fire scene with Acting Sergeant Justin Powell. Mr. Fulliger confirmed in his evidence that the cause and origin of the Muck Creek fire was best marked as undetermined. Acting Sergeant Powell also gave a statement in respect of the Muck Creek fire. Again, he described the area as remote within dense bushland with steep terrain. There was no infrastructure, power lines, buildings or rail lines near the scene. The fire did not appear to be the result of deliberate or accidental ignition. The only fire indicator for the Muck Creek fire was again the angle of char observed on trees at the scene. This is the photograph taken from 150 of the brief, and it shows the fire crossing Muck Road from west to east, which was consistent with the location of the fire scene initially mapped by the RFS as west of Muck Creek Road. So Acting Sergeant Powell was unable to determine the cause and origin of the Muck Creek fire, but those angle of chars, that angle of char is consistent with the fire being initially mapped to the west of the road. We next considered, Your Honour, the Black Mountain Road fire. Senior Sergeant Scott Gain, attached to the Northern Rivers Crime Scene Services Branch, undertook a cause and origin investigation of both the Black Mountain Road and the 1260 Road fires on 21 August 2020. In his statement, Senior Sergeant Gain described the fire scene for the Black Mountain Road fire as dense bushland, which he accessed by well-maintained fire trails. Angle of char on trees showed a generally southern fire direction. He found evidence of heavy machinery use in trees which had been pushed over and dirt mounted up, possibly as a consequence of the maintenance of the fire trail. Trees in these files had subsequently been impacted by fire. There were no overhead power lines. Senior Sergeant Gain gave evidence that his inspection of the Black Mountain Road fire scene was hampered by the passage of time. This is a photograph taken from page 175 of the brief, and it shows, consistent with Senior Sergeant Gain's evidence, vegetation regrowth and fresh leaf litter, which had essentially obliterated the majority of the fire indicators. All that remained was angle of char on some trees, which demonstrated the fire moved up the slope from a creek bed. At Black Mountain Road, Senior Sergeant Gain identified a tree which had been ring-barked before the fire moved through. This is illustrated in the photograph taken from page 179 of the brief. Senior Sergeant Gain did not consider the tree to be relevant to the cause of the Black Mountain Road fire, but included reference to it in his report because, in his words, it was simply the fact that this was evidence that there had been human activity in this area, which was extremely remote, and on the outset we assumed that it was probably only really accessed by forest workers. There were no campgrounds nearby. There was no infrastructure or anything to draw people there, but this damaged tree down by the creek bed demonstrated to us that there were people who frequented the area. We don't know how often and we don't know when, but there had been people there. Senior Sergeant Gain also identified a tree which might have been struck by lightning. This is the photo now displayed, taken from page 180 of the brief. The evidence of this included splintering of the upper limbs and trunk, which could have been a lightning scar. There was also scattered and splintered upper limbs and parts of the trunk found at the base of the tree. Senior Sergeant Gain couldn't, however, exclude the possibility that these were the effects of wind damage impacting upon parts of a dead tree. He didn't see evidence of rock or soil disturbance at the base of the tree consistent with lightning strike. Whilst a photograph of the suspect tree might have suggested part of the tree had been burnt internally, Senior Sergeant Gain clarified that the photo in fact depicted a shadow in the internal hollow of the upper trunk rather than fire damage. So that's the shadow displayed at the top of the fractured part of the tree, displayed in the image here. Furthermore, Senior Sergeant Gain emphasised that this was not an investigation in which he'd been able to track fire indicators to a point of origin and there discovered a tree with the hallmarks of lightning at the spot. Rather, he could do no more than establish a rather large general area of origin, which included the damaged tree. Senior Sergeant Gain had considered lightning strike data, which showed lightning in the vicinity of the Black Mountain Road fire, but not within its close proximity. The Senior Sergeant Gain concluded that the cause and origin of the Black Mountain fire was undetermined. I'm conscious of the time, Your Honour. I don't have too much further to say by way of submissions. Are you content for me to continue?
Yes, thank you.
Moving to the 1260 Road fire. During his scene investigation for the 1260 Road fire, also conducted on 21 August 2020, Senior Sergeant Gain identified a tree with an appearance consistent with lightning strike. So this photo is taken from page 217 of the brief. This is the tree that Senior Sergeant Gain identified, and he said it was splintered high up. The tree was splintered high up, had splintered high up, and at its stump, you can see the stump evident there, where the tree had fractured, leaving debris behind. He could not discount that this was simply a dead tree which had been impacted by wind, but he said it was unusual compared with other fallen dead trees nearby. The tree didn't have any other signs of having been struck by lightning. Senior Sergeant Gain was more confident that he had come across the area of origin for the 1260 Road fire than he had been for the Black Mountain Road fire, because here the charring on trees was lower on the trunk, suggesting a lower intensity fire burning in the fire's early stages. He was nonetheless not able to pinpoint a specific area of origin for the 1260 Road fire. Coupled with this, lightning strike data more closely aligned with the general area of origin of the 1260 Road fire and gave more weight to lightning strike as a potential cause of that fire. Senior Sergeant Gain described the area of the 1260 Road fire as steep, rocky ground, whose fire trails were accessible by four-wheel drive vehicle only, albeit the area he examined was easily accessible by foot, no more than 50 metres from off the fire trails. It was nonetheless a very remote location. Notwithstanding the comparatively stronger evidence of lightning strike and a greater degree of confidence in the area of origin, Senior Sergeant Gain was still unable to determine the cause and origin of the 1260 Road fire. Finally, Sergeant Gain estimated the distance between the Black Mountain Road fire and the 1260 Road fire as 5 kilometres by road and 2 to 3 kilometres as the crow flies. Given this proximity, he could not exclude the possibility that the cause of one fire was related to the other. Moving then to the Liberation Trail fire cause and origin. As already stated, on 13 August 2020, Mr Fullagar attended the Liberation Trail fire scene with New South Wales Police. He described the Liberation Trail as a ridgetop trail in steep and hilly country, making a scene examination quite difficult. He was only able to safely veer 20 to 40 metres off the trail because of the nature of the terrain. This, along with the passage of time since the fire, meant that he was unable to identify a specific point of origin, which in turn effectively constrained any determination of fire cause. Mr Fullagar had reviewed RFS records, including the chronology and fire progression mapping, and he also reviewed the lightning strike data before giving his evidence. Notwithstanding this additional material, Mr Fullagar maintained his opinion that the cause and origin of the Liberation Trail fire was undetermined. It has been established that crews were patrolling and responding to events along the northern edge, that is, in the Liberation sector, of the Bees Nest fire from at least 25 October 2019. Further, early reports of the fire that would become known as the Liberation Trail fire had it burning to the west of the trail. Mr Fullagar was unable to say whether the slop-over referred to on the afternoon of 27 October 2019 was the initial area of origin for the Liberation Trail fire. Mr Fullagar's evidence as to the estimated distance between the reported location of the Liberation Trail fire and the closest edge of the Bees Nest fire to the south raised the possibility that the former fire was a spot over from the latter. That is, the council assisting team had asked the RFS to attempt to estimate the distance between the two, and in his evidence, Mr Fullagar said, "I put it as about 1.2 kilometres from the northern edge, but I think our predictive services did the same, and I think they had it at 1.05 from the northern edge of the Bees Nest fire." Even taking the greater of the two estimates, Mr Fullagar told the court it is possible for a fire to spot as far as 1.2 kilometres and in the right conditions to spot even further. However, possibilities are not sufficient to ground a finding as to point of origin or cause of origin of the fire in the circumstances of this inquiry. As photographs from the scene showing raked vegetation and a drip burnt stick on the eastern side of the Liberation Trail demonstrate, the court would accept that this was evidence of backburning operations. This likely occurred in an attempt to suppress the spread of the fire from the western side of the Liberation Trail and was not implicated in the commencement of the Liberation Trail fire. It follows from all of the above, the court would accept Mr Fullagar's evidence that the cause of the Liberation Trail fire is undetermined. So summarising those various cause and origin findings. The Schultz Road fire started on 25 October 2019 in bushland off Schultz Road, Nimboida, within the Ellis State Forest. A point of origin could not be determined due to passage of time, resulting in the majority of the wildfire directional indicators being lost, and the steep terrain which hampered access for an investigation into area of origin. The absence of a point of origin meant that certain potential causes have not been ruled out, and it is submitted that the cause and origin of the Schultz Road fire is undetermined. The Muck Creek fire started on 25 October 2019 in the Clouds Creek State Forest. Its point of origin could not be determined due to the passage of time leading to vegetation regrowth at the scene. A number of potential causes were eliminated, but others could not be ruled out, and it is submitted that the cause and origin of the Muck Creek fire are undetermined. The Black Mountain Road fire started on 25 October 2019 in the Kangaroo River State Forest, and it is submitted the cause and origin of the fire is undetermined. The 1260 Road fire started on the same day, 25 October 2019, also in the Kangaroo River State Forest, and it is submitted that the cause and origin of that fire is undetermined. The Liberation Trail fire started sometime on or before 27 October 2019 to the west of the Liberation Trail, and it is submitted that the cause and origin of that fire are undetermined. So finally, Your Honour, those assisting the court express again their sincere gratitude to those who have aided and provided information to the court to assist with the coronial inquiry into the Liberation Trail fire.
Thank you, Ms. Wall. That brings us to the end of the proceedings today.
That's right, Your Honour. Tomorrow there will be a directions hearing commencing at 10 a.m. and then, Your Honour, we'll hear closing submissions into the following matters. The Long Gully Road fire, Drake, which includes closing submissions into the inquest into the death of Robert Lindsay and the inquest into the death of Gwendolyn Hyde. Then closing submissions for the fire inquiry into the Werry Berry fire, the Adaminaby Complex fire, and the Border Rockton fire.
Thank you. Unless there's anything you wish to raise, Ms. Woodland, we will adjourn till 10 a.m. tomorrow.
Thank you, Your Honour.
Thank you.